What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Oh My Pod, the podcast that teaches you how to launch, automate, and grow your podcast. My name is Justin J. Moore, and I help coaches launch podcasts that only take them 1 or 2 hours a week to manage. Now, let me know if this sounds anything like you. Do you ever feel like your podcast is just like stuck and you're putting out episodes and you're spending this time doing these things, or you might even be spending a bunch of money on production, but the numbers just aren't moving? And obviously, this is like not what you expected when you went to start your podcast. Because starting a podcast is not like a super easy thing to do. So you put time and effort into it, and you thought that you were going to get some sort of big payout, big audience or something. And then the most common thing that people will tell you is that you have a marketing problem, you have a promotion problem, and so you might go look for some type of podcast promoter. You might even pay somebody to do that. But I'm going to tell you why that's not just wrong. When people say that marketing is the problem, it's not just wrong, but it's actually the anti-truth. In this episode, I'm going to tell you 3 things that you need to get right before your show can even have the possibility to grow. Because I want to first of all tell you that if I were to send 100,000 people to your podcast tomorrow to listen to one of the episodes, and you get 100,000 downloads for one episode, it doesn't really matter how many downloads you get on that one episode if you can't keep anybody for the next one or the next one, because you're just going to pay for a spike of downloads that mean nothing. And after that, they're just going to go, because the show has no clear mission that it's on to keep people invested in the process and in the journey. So let's get into the 3 reasons why your show probably isn't growing, and why your show it's impossible for it to grow until you fix these 3 things. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say before we get into it, we have a free school community on the platform School. It's called the CoachCast Academy. And in there, you'll find literally thousands of dollars of courses and templates and resources for free. But you'll also find opportunities to connect with other podcasters, to get guests for your show, or to go on to shows as a guest. So it's a great networking space. And the link for that is in the show notes. I really, really hope to see you in there. I'd also love to talk to you in there, so you can come in and chat with me and Celine, and you can ask us questions and whatever. It's just supposed to be a fun space for podcasters. All right, let's get into the meat and potatoes, though, of this episode. So the first reason why your podcast is probably why it's impossible for your show to grow is because you just don't know who your listener actually is. If I were to ask you exactly who your listener is, I'm willing to bet that if your show is not growing and you're experiencing no growth, that you would not be able to tell me who your listener really actually is. And there's a few reasons why knowing who your listener is going to make all the difference. I mean, number 1, it's going to be a guide for you on what type of content to create in your solo episodes. So if you don't really know who your listener is, you're going to end up making content that's sort of vague and ambiguous, because you're trying to cater to all kinds of people at different points of their journey who are doing different things. And so you're sort of trying to cast a wide net, and in that net you're catching nobody. And that's going to be like one of the main reasons why, if you have somebody come to your show, they're not going to stick around episode after episode unless they're certain that the show is going to constantly create content that solves their problems, right? So you need to know who your listener is. And another reason why this is so freaking important is because if you want to bring guests onto your show, but you don't really know who's listening and you don't know who the show is for exactly, then finding guests who are actually going to help your listener and be interesting to your listener is going to be really hard. And so you're going to find that one episode is a complete hit and the next one is a complete miss, because you're bringing guests on without being able to like handpick the ones that are best for your show. And so you're just sort of talking to whoever is interesting. And so what you need to do in order to know who your listener is, and what we recommend people do, is like literally write down like a name for a person. So our listener's name is Jimmy. Write down their fears, their dreams, what their ultimate goals are, who their heroes are, who their anti-heroes are, what kind of podcast they listen to. Most people just say like, oh, I'm talking to marketing professionals, male marketing professionals between the ages of 33 or 30 and 55 or something like that. But that's not that doesn't actually help you craft specific content for that person, because you don't know exactly what type of problems those people are experiencing. And so anyways, that's number one. You need to know who your listener is. Okay. Number two, and this is something that's sort of a new thing that we're finding. Okay. But it's that your podcast intro is just no good. So if you're not able to hook the listener in within the first 60 to 90 seconds of the show, they're going to click away. And if you think about it, it's really easy to understand why that is. I mean, a podcast is can be between 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes even 2 or 3 hours long. So what that means is that you're asking somebody to spend their time listening to this rather than something else, meaning you're asking them to make a commitment. You're asking them to commit to your show rather than something else. And in order for them to make that uncomfortable act of committing their time to something, they need to have something that's strong enough to convince them to listen through. And so the main thing that's happening to people is that they're playing this pre-recorded canned intro with copyright-free music that sounds kind of corporate, and it's someone else doing the voiceover, or it's them doing the voiceover. People are always going to skip that, by the way. Nobody wants to listen to that. And so they end up in your show with no real context of what the show's mission is, what the episode's going to do for them. And they sort of just feel like your show is lazy and that you're not actually paying attention to them as a listener. So the way that we have our clients do their intros is pretty simple. It's really simple, actually. You just need to tell the listener the name of the show. So like I did at the beginning, welcome back to Oh My Pod. Then you need to tell them the tagline or the mission of the show, which is also what I did. I said, welcome back to Oh My Pod, the podcast that helps you launch, automate, and grow your podcast. So I just did the name, the show name, the tagline. And then the third part that you need to tell them is your name. So you need to introduce yourself and say something about you, right? Whether that's something that gives you credibility or just something that explains who you are and what you do a little bit. So the show, the tagline, and then your name as the host and your intro. So what that would look like, again, what I did at the beginning was, welcome back to Oh My Pod, the podcast that helps you launch, automate, and grow your podcast. My name is Justin J. Moore, and I help coaches launch podcasts that take only 1 or 2 hours a week to manage. And then after that, you need to hook them. And that is you giving context of what to expect in that specific episode. So you've told them what the name of the show, the mission of the show or the tagline, and then your introduction. And that's great because now they have context about what the heck's actually going on in this podcast. And that's also really good because this may be the first episode that they ever listen to. Episode 25 or 50 might be the first episode they listen to. Most people aren't going to go back to the first one when they go into a new show. So anyways, now you got to hook them. And so the hook, there's, 2 ways that we recommend people do it. The first one would be to start with some type of question, and some type of question that your listener is asking and that you know that they're asking. And so that just happens to be what I did at the beginning of this episode. I said, do you ever feel like your podcast is just sort of stuck, no matter how good the content is, the numbers aren't budging? So I'm starting with a question and I'm calling you out, the person who is struggling with growing their podcast or struggling with having their podcast actually be worth their time. But there's other ways you can hook them too. But another favorite way would be to start with some type of story, because obviously people love stories. Stories make complex information simple to understand. So some type of story would be great. An example of starting with a story would be what I did on one of our last episodes where I talked about podcast guesting. And in that one, I started with a story. I said, client of ours went onto a podcast, and after the episode, they got 9 clients. It's almost $100,000 that they got. And the way that they got that was, anyways, okay, so you get the idea, right? Starting with some type of story or starting with a question. So your intro, every single time, the name of your show, the tagline or the show's mission, your name as the host, so introduce yourself, and then the hook. So all together with me, that looked like, welcome back to Oh My Pod, the podcast that helps you launch, automate, and grow your podcast. My name is Justin J. Moore, and I help coaches launch podcasts that only take 1 or 2 hours a week to manage. And I want to know, have you ever struggled with growing your podcast? Like you just put out content week after week and you think it's great, but no matter what you do, you're not seeing the numbers grow. Okay, there's the hook, right? And now we've done our intro. Okay, that is so much better than those canned intros that people are doing that give no context and frankly are going to have people just going to listen to something else right away rather than spending their valuable time listening to an episode that they have no idea what it's going to do for them or how it's going to benefit them. So yeah, the other thing, just briefly before we move on to the next part, is you can have your music playing behind that whole part and sort of setting the stage for your show. And so there's an element there where people feel like they're taken care of because you still have the music and you still have the classic podcast intro feel, but it's dynamic and it changes every single time. And the listener immediately knows okay, this show is not lazy. This show is putting the time in every time to give me good context. They're not using pre-recorded material. I want to come back over and over again because I know that they're crafting their content for me as a listener. So that's huge. Okay, the third and last reason, well, there might be more reasons, but the 3 reasons that we're talking about today, the third one is going to be that you're only doing interview episodes. Now, what we were finding from surveys, from audience surveys and from retention rates and consumption rates, how much of the episode people are listening to, where they're dropping off, is that solo episodes have a way higher retention rate than interviews. And if you think about the reason why, you can just logically think about why that is, and it makes sense. Interviews, the way that most people do them, there's usually 2 problems. The first problem is that they're unguided and they go off the rails like crazy. The second problem is that the guest is not actually that good of a guest for this show, right? And so the reason why solo episodes are so great is because they provide actionable, concise advice to the listener, and they allow the listener to connect with you as the host, which ensures that they keep coming back. When you're just doing an interview episode or interview podcast, your listener's really only coming for the guest, right? Because you are only the one asking the questions. And most of the times with most people, you're not even adding anything. You're just asking questions because you think that that's how to be a good interviewer. And the problem with that is that your listeners coming back over and over again will just rely on who the guest is. So solo episodes they provide targeted, actionable advice. The guardrails are up. You're crafting content specifically around that topic that you decided to talk about. And there's no meandering, or maybe just a little bit. But you're building a relationship with the listener. Now, this isn't to say that interviews are a bad form of content. It's just that most people are doing the interviews wrong. Rather than cherry picking the right guest for their audience and asking questions that their audience is actually asking and making sure that the interviews are guided and stay on track, people just bring on people who are within their network who they want to talk to, and they just talk about whatever, right? They just go into the person's backstory, and there's no real value to the listener other than maybe a good success story. But they can kind of get that anywhere else anyways, with people who are much more successful and much more famous. So it's just not anything unique. So if you are bringing people on for interviews, it's just way better to think about the interview as you and the guest solving a problem for your listener together, rather than you and the guest just talking and having your listener be a fly on the wall. So let's say I wanted to bring a guest onto this show. I would think about a topic that I'm not an expert in totally. So maybe I would say, how to set up the perfect podcast backdrop. So lighting and camera and stuff like that. I'm not an expert in that. I know a good amount, but I'm not an expert. So I would immediately go look for somebody who's an expert, because I know that my listener is interested in that topic and that's a problem that they need solved, and I don't have all the tools to solve it. So logically, I need to bring somebody else on or go do a ton of research and, spend my time doing that. But I don't want to do that. I'd rather just have somebody else come on and help my listener. So I bring this person on, and instead of saying, hey, John, I just want to talk to you about your life story and what your business does. It's okay, that's what everybody does. How about instead, hey, John, I want you to come on to my podcast because I am struggling with this problem. My listeners want to know the answer, and I don't really know enough to answer it, but you do. So how about you come on to my podcast and help my listeners come up with the best way to do a podcast backdrop? So we can talk about lighting, stuff like that. So does that sound like a good idea? And the guest's going to be like, heck yeah, that's awesome, because I now know what to expect from the episode. I'm not just coming on with no idea what the mission of this episode is or what the listener is dealing with. Now I actually know, okay, we're working on this problem together. Well, now I'm prepped and I know exactly what I'm going to talk about, and this could be fun. Okay. So that's the right way to do an interview, not to have these unguided interviews where, they're like 50 minutes of just meandering. Okay. The other reason why solo episodes are great is because they are incredibly high leverage for your time. So if I was to go and do, let's just take an example. Let's say a fitness, or let's say a nutrition coach has a podcast, right? And they were going to talk about nutrition for male hormone health or something. If I was to go and try and do a solo episode about male hormone health or nutrition as it pertains to male hormone health, it would take me like probably days to research and to like come up with a really good episode around that topic. But if you're a male hormone expert or a nutrition expert and you have expertise in male hormone health, it's going to be so freaking easy for you to create a really high quality, like 20 or 25 minute episode about that. So what would take someone else days will take you like 30 minutes to plan, because you talk about this stuff all the time. You're an expert. You know all the things, you just have to put it onto paper. So solo episodes are so high leverage, and they give you an advantage over people who are not an expert in what you do, because you can use a small amount of your time for what would take them a huge amount of time. So in summary, there are 3 things that are stopping your show from growing. And even if I was to deliver 100,000 people to your show tomorrow, it'd be like filling water into a leaky bucket, because they wouldn't keep coming back. So those 3 things are, again, you don't really know who your listener is. So you don't really know who to make content for. Your content is kind of vague and ambiguous, and you don't really know how to find the right guests for those people. Second is that your podcast intro is just kind of lame. You really need to give people context. You need to tell them what the show's mission is. You need to introduce yourself, and then you need to hook them and give them context, or they're just going to go somewhere else. And number 3, you're only doing interviews, unguided interviews. So that means that you're never doing solo episodes, allowing your listeners to really connect with you as the host. And also that your interviews are unguided. So they're kind of meandering, and listeners they don't appreciate that there's a lot of fluff, and they would rather just have actionable advice. Yeah. So I hope this was helpful. We're going to do a lot more content like this, solo episodes, because we were also doing just a lot of interviews. They weren't unguided, and they definitely were targeted, but we want to be able to talk to you guys one-on-one a lot more. So I hope this was helpful, and thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so you made it this far, which means you probably found something or learned something valuable from this. So don't be selfish. Please share it with somebody else so that they can learn something from it too. That's all we ask for all this free content. We're trying to build a community and help as many people as possible do better in podcasting, make better podcasts, get more from their podcasts in less time. That's our goal here. And if you want to support that goal, then just click the link and send it to one person who you know would love you for it.